Dogman, and the Los Angeles Lizard Man. Dear Scary Stories NYC, if you do an internet search about underground lizard people in Los Angeles, you'll get all sorts of different takes on the legend. In one version, there really was an underground tribe called the Snake Brothers, but they were normal human Native Americans whose worship involved snakes. In other versions of the legend, these are reptile people like the Sleestacks from Saturday morning TV. Of course, the mainstream view is that none of this was ever real, and it's all just entertaining legend. I guess that's what I would think about it as well, except for all the stories I heard when I used to live out there on the West Coast. And the reason those stories carry weight with me is that I once saw one of these Snake Brothers in physical battle with something that sounds just like what your channel calls a dogman. After I saw that, with my own eyes, I had to go back and think again about all the lizard man and dogman stories I had been hearing up to that point. To be honest, it might sound rude to mention, but the only people who ever told me stories about the dogman or the lizard man in those days were those less affluent. And they also consumed certain contraband inhalants and injectants which were popular in show business back in that century. If I had heard that the president of Arista Records was telling me that the Dogman or the Lizard Man were real, I might have taken it more seriously, but the president of Arista did not tell me those stories. Guys scraping by as script doctors and guys not really scraping by at all as songwriters, those were the ones telling me that there were bipedal man-like chimeras living in tunnels underneath parts of Los Angeles. Some of them were scaly and had heads like short-nosed alligators. Others of them were furry and had heads like jackals or hyenas or wolves. That was an interesting time to be in Los Angeles, by which I mean 1972 through 1975. Various members of the recently broken up Beatles were recording there on any given night. The breakup of the studio system removed most censorship from feature films, and as only some of us knew, the underground activity of the lizard people had grown tumultuous and warlike, allegedly bubbling up to the surface time and time again. I was working in and around the music and B-movie picture business in LA back then, and some of my personal acquaintances led me into a world featuring not only the famous partying of that era, but the dark underside of that world as well, featuring both Dogman and Snake Brothers. Let's start this story at the end, then work back around to the beginning. I was in Elysian Park in Los Angeles on a bright sunny day, somewhere on the side of a big hill. I was being led by an old man we can call Lee, who had told me beforehand about this place that we were entering into. There was a tunnel that went straight into the hill itself. Something seemed strange to me about it straight off. This was not an ordinary kind of feature one would find in a city park in a place like Los Angeles. Don't bother trying to locate it on Google Street View or Satellite View, as it's not there, and I looked. But on that night, back in the early 1970s, if Google Street View had used the satellite image for that precise moment that Lee and I were there, maybe, just maybe, they would have shown what we saw, which was a small cave leading into a tunnel. The walls of the tunnel had an ancient appearance to them, and it seemed unnaturally dark inside there. Even in the light of early afternoon, I couldn't see more than 15 or 20 feet in front of us down the roughly carved-out hall. Once I took a couple of steps into the darkness, I found that my flashlight only lit the path in front of me about 10 or 12 feet max. It felt incredibly unsafe moving forward, the two of us, down this tunnel that was only about 4 men wide. In that century, young people were still encouraged and expected to be adventurous and daring, so we eagerly pressed forward. After the stories I had heard from Lee and others, I wanted to finally see these allegedly real bipedal cryptids for myself. That's another way people were different back then. We all thought we were Captain Kirk, and we really wanted to explore and find out about the world for ourselves in an open-minded way. I'm not encouraging free thought, of course. I don't want to get your channel in trouble. I'm just noting that this took place a long time ago, when we still didn't know any better. Of course, you should never do what we did, because we ventured out of our safe space, and we nearly got harmed by violence. The old school 20th century definition of the word, I mean, like actual physical harm. We avoided it, though, as two really big chimera men tumbled by, engaged in mortal combat. Again, I mean the words in a literal sense. Lee shouted, "Hug the wall," and his cry was still echoing as the hairy, jackal-headed demon and the scaly, greenish salamander man rolled past us and out of the entrance of the cave itself. Lee and I were able to watch from the cave opening as the two humanoids engaged in a fight utilizing both tooth and claw, fist and nail. It was interesting to see how similar, and yet how different the battle styles of the two creatures were. If it were true that their clans had been warring for years, I wondered how much the fighting techniques had changed and adapted to each other over time. Each sought to gain advantage by being on top, so when they would separate, both would circle and look for a path toward leaping up on top and forcing the other back and down. Then, each had a variant of the back-clawed attack on his opponent's belly. The Dogman would hold the reptile down by his shoulders, then attempt to swipe with the long claws on the toes of his hind paws. When the situation was reversed, and the lizard humanoid had the upper hand, he would slash at the massive canine's belly with his hind legs, but using the extra-long knife-sharp dew claw in the heel of his dinosaur-like foot as his key means of attack. Both creatures snapped at each other's throats, demonstrating that much of the Dogman's attack was generated by the lizard part of his mind. My mind had jumped to an assumption that these two big, angry cryptids were one and the same as the two that Lee had told me about. I suppose I better backtrack to that story for it to make sense. You see, I met Lee, who was 10 years my senior, through a production assistant who was 5 years my junior. He and I were assigned to unload a truck on a movie set, and I noticed he was more tired than usual. In fact, the young PA was so tired that he didn't care anymore, and he just told me that he had been staying in a basement apartment, but he had seen a 5-foot-tall reptilian down there, and so he had slept in the doorway of a building nearby instead. I offered to let him stay with me for the rest of the shoot, but it turned out he was already moving in with the wardrobe lady. So, that was the first I had heard about the lizard people alleged to live under Los Angeles. I wondered if it might be true, but I also wondered if that kid was just sleep-deprived, or maybe he was faking it to get to move in with the wardrobe lady, who was a wonderful bohemian spark plug of positivity, always fun to be around. This guy would tell stories about the lizard people like other crew members would talk about the Dodgers score. He acted like everyone believed in these things. A number of his stories involved a character we'll call Lee. Yes, the same Lee that turned out to be real later on. I forget if Lee and the PA met in that same building basement or somewhere else, but according to the legend, the underground city of the lizard people was located under Chinatown in LA. I say was, as in it had been, but it was during this period that a number of the tunnels were closed off or filled up. I'm not very clear on how much of that might have been done by the warring factions living under there, how much of that might have been done by local government on the surface looking out for the safety of the human population, or how much of it might have been done by well-moneyed private interests taking matters into their own hands. After all, what is located just to the north of old Chinatown except a sports ball park for a famous sports ball league? And just what is north of that famous stadium? Yup, Elysian Park. So, when the tunnels were blocked and destroyed and filled down in Chinatown, the creatures living in those tunnels were forced to move just a little bit north. This might explain the reason for the fighting, that both clans had shrinking space to occupy down there due to pressures from the surface. I wondered if the fighting seemed to end after 1975 because the creatures were wiped out, driven off, or if they burrowed new tunnels and caves to live in somewhere else that we surface dwellers didn't care about as much. I know that they either possessed great wealth or else possibly scientific knowledge because of one of the stories I heard the first time I got to meet Lee in person. He no longer was living in that part of Chinatown. In fact, he was the first person to talk to me about Elysian Park. The story he told that sticks out most strongly in my memory is the one about what he called the Gleaming Chamber. So according to Lee, there were still remains of several underground cities in that area. Not all of them were property of the lizard people. One night a year or two before this, Lee claimed that he saw a lizard man having a battle with a dogman or wolf-headed man, and it seemed to be a turf battle, since the fighting was going on outside a chamber containing brightly lit gleaming objects, the so-called Gleaming Room. The reason I had ended up in Elysian Park, in that cave that shouldn't have been there, was because of this story. Lee claimed that he happened upon the cave opening by accident. Feeling tired, he walked inside the cave to get a nap, and he fell asleep pretty quickly. Soon, he felt a jolt to his body almost as though there had been an earthquake, and he found himself awake and aware in a few seconds. Realizing that the sounds were coming from down that long dark tunnel, Lee took off into the darkness because his generation had been even more encouraged to think for themselves and to be brave than my generation had. He walked past the point where he and I would almost be run over by the battling creatures years afterward, and into what he said was complete and utter blinding darkness. He felt along one wall to make sure that he kept going in one direction, and after some time, Lee claimed that he saw a flickering light off in the distance. Sometimes it flickered in a golden hue, sometimes it seemed silvery, and other times there were flashes of colors which the man found indescribable, at least in English, which was not his initial language. And since I only knew English, we're all left to wonder what colors besides gold and silver shone out of the darkness to the man on that night. Eventually, the tunnel widened into a darkened chamber within which the brilliantly lit treasure, or perhaps devices, existed. The two figures fighting in silhouette in front of the apparently opened room wore no loincloths. They used no weapons. One would leap upon the other, trying to finish him off with one quick series of maneuvers, only to find himself thrown across the room as his intended prey used his own momentum against him. Time and again they used variations on each other's attacks, never seeming to tire, never seeming to grow even the slightest less manic and vicious. The frantic, savage nature of their no-holds-barred beatdowns on each other was the most striking thing about the situation to Lee, so he fled that tunnel and almost left the cave as well. Something told him to look outside before he did, and the sky was now orange. Plants that should have been green were aqua blue colored. Lee claims he hid in the corner of the cave, terrified, waiting for the colors to go back to normal, which it seemed they would never do. He was afraid, it seems, that he might get trapped in the wrong reality if he left the cave at the wrong time. People from his generation were usually more patient than I ever was. Lee told me he hid in the shadows of that cave waiting, but not knowing what he was waiting for. Eventually, the two creatures he had seen fighting inside the cave chased each other down the long dark tunnel into the cave entrance that Lee was hiding inside of, and then outside into the night, which Lee noticed looked like a normal night is supposed to look. According to how he told me the story, that was when he ran out of the cave and never looked back. I asked him how he knew that this was the correct reality on that night. He looked me in the eye, and he told me that he still wasn't sure that he was in the correct reality. He didn't think he'd ever be sure he was in the same dimension he started in. That guy had his own version of the Mandela effect years before the Mandela effect was a thing. Anyway, the story of the gleaming room was the reason I talked Lee into taking me back to where he had supposedly seen these cryptids. Assuming it was fake, I'd find out soon enough. But if it was real, then there were so many different things to consider. For instance, whatever was in that room they were fighting over was brightly lit and was shining and gleaming under that brilliant illumination. I never understood if Lee was describing great wealth, as in gold coins, or if he meant he had seen machinery or computers lit bright by electricity and advanced knowledge. Exactly what kind of wealth was being guarded, and which one of them was the guard? Was the Dogman attempting to break in on the lizard people's horde? Or was that a reptile enemy agent attempting to steal the wealth of the wolf-headed people? Anyway, as I had been saying earlier, the gleaming chamber and all of these other stories led to me and Lee actually standing inside that cave entrance that you cannot find on Google Maps, on the side of the tall hill in Elysian Park in Los Angeles. He brought me there to prove to me that his stories were real, and I was staring out the cave entrance, watching the Dogman and the lizard humanoid trying to tear each other apart, limb from limb, with the city of Los Angeles blinking and shining in the night like the invaluable horde in the gleaming room. The reptiles' attacks were more savage at first than the lupine cryptid, but when the Dogman saw how it was gonna be, he demonstrated that predators with fur can be as inhumanly savage as those with green, scaly skin. Lee pointed out that the image of the fighting was growing wavery. I looked and I saw that the lights of the city beyond the fighting were no longer stationary. Now they kind of buzzed in little rotations. Lee snapped me to attention, and he insisted we had to get out of that cave entrance while we still could. We needed to run directly at the two fighting creatures, and it had to happen while the two realities were still tenuously connected. It was one of those situations where we waited until the moment when the fear of losing our gateway back to our version of reality outweighed our fear of getting torn apart by oversized predators. And then, when that moment arrived, we skedaddled forward. Once we ran outside, everything was as it had been before we went inside. That is to say, no 9-foot-tall monsters engaged in battle. When we turned around, there was no cave. There was no tunnel. I knew it would be gone before I even looked because something in the atmosphere had changed. Maybe the air pressure. Maybe some sound frequency I was only hearing or noticing subconsciously. I went back to that park with Lee on 2 different occasions after that. One was only about a month afterward, and the second time was maybe a year or so after that. We never found any cave entrance there again, but we had a nice afternoon each time and got a little exercise. Then after Lee passed away, I went back to the spot with some friends who were into paranormal and ESP type subjects. I mean, they were into it the way we all were in the mid-1970s. They had seen an episode or 2 of Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, and now they wanted to know more about ghosts or Bigfoot or UFOs or anything else that seemed hard to fully explain to our generation. These guys brought newfangled, to me at least, chaos and Discordian magical spells with them that I think they copied out of the Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Anton Wilson. They had all sort of fancy wordplay, but we didn't find any cave that night either. Although I heard a number of stories, I only ever got to see the Lizard Man of Los Angeles that one time, and the way it all went down demonstrates to me that this underground world that these creatures come from, it's only sometimes actually there. To us, at least. That's why the mainstream is correct when they say it's not real. Sometimes, I think it really probably isn't. But what if some other times, for reasons that I know I haven't figured out yet, what if some other times you can walk into that world, and parts of that world can walk out into ours? Maybe that explains a lot of monster and cryptid sightings. The creatures accidentally wander into our reality, or we accidentally wander into theirs. I remember flying back to LA for business in 1981 or 82, and it just seems so different already. I couldn't imagine a story about lizard people happening in Los Angeles by then. It had become something else. I wonder if anyone has heard any more recent stories involving the Dogman and the Los Angeles Lizard Man. Lots of other shows would gladly wish for an EP as badass as Bradley. I don't think I'm talking out of school to mention that Bradley Poole is quite cool. Please join us in thanking Bradley Poole, whose kind contributions made this episode possible. In exchange, Bradley gets to see our secret Sunday Uncensored stories and our 21 hours of archived secret uncensored stories too. Not only that, but Bradley gets to see our secret Werewolf Wednesday shows, in which $7 and $10 channel members get to see a preview of a show in advance of the general public. In fact, Bradley Poole is so cool, he watched this episode yesterday. And now, here's our spokesdog Henry Lee Dogman to clue you in on all the rest. Hank? Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com, and that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.